version of inclusion I've been offered throughout my career. It looks good on paper. It sounds progressive. But it assumes a body that moves quickly, doesn't fatigue, doesn't need care, and doesn't take too much space. So even when people are present, their body still feels like the problem, not the system. For many disabled and racialized people in fashion, inclusion means being invited into spaces that quietly asks us to leave parts of ourselves behind. And I've seen that happen a little too often. I've always been drawn to creativity, storytelling, fashion, and image making. Fashion fascinated me because of its power. It shapes culture before culture becomes aware of its influence. Fashion is deeply connected to the future. It operates in a similar logic to other predictive systems people rely on today, including artificial intelligence. Both fashion and AI systems are built on patterns of what has already been seen, risk repeating and amplifying those patterns unless we intervene in what gets defined as normal, ideal, or desirable. But growing up, I also became aware of who was consistently being missing from these spaces. I rarely saw disabled individuals, those who use mobility aids, bodies that move differently, BIPOC individuals centered beyond tokenism. And when you do not see yourself repeatedly reflected somewhere, you begin to understand that the absence is not accidental. It is designed. In regards to changing the system, this refers to interconnected structures that shape the industry, like casting practices, design standards, and production timelines. Later, when I began working within fashion and modeling spaces, I saw more clearly how much conformity existed behind the scenes. I saw how environments were structured around speed, aesthetics, endurance, and performance. I saw how accessibility was often treated as an afterthought rather than a foundation. And I kept asking myself, why are certain bodies being celebrated while others are erased? Who gets to decide what a runway body should look like? And more importantly, who benefits from those decisions? Because fashion is often dismissed as superficial, but fashion is never just clothing. Fashion is messaging, infrastructure, social training. Every runway, every campaign, every casting decision teaches us something about whose bodies belong in public life and whose bodies are treated as interruptions to it. This is why I say fashion is deeply connected to the future. Now, let's imagine with me. Let's not look at the runway as just a stage, but rather a future-making machine. Every season, it tells us the bodies that will be seen, celebrated, desired, hired, and carried into tomorrow. When only certain bodies are consistently designed for, those bodies become the future, while others are positioned as accommodations, exceptions, or afterthoughts. That realization became the foundation of my major research project. I entered inclusive design because I wanted the language for the things I've been seeing my whole life. I wanted the tools to question the systems that exclude people while pretending to welcome them. What I love most about inclusive design is that it was never only about accessibility. It was about participation, dignity, co-creation, designing with communities instead of for them. That mindset changed everything for me. And eventually, it led me to ask one question that became the center of my thesis. What if inclusion is not about getting a seat at the table, but about redesigning the chair? That question became Reimagining the Runway. Now, when people hear fashion show, they often think spectacle, lights, camera, action, right? But Reimagining the Runway was something very different. It was a participant-led research project disguised as a runway. It became a living experiment in what happens when people who are historically excluded from fashion spaces are no longer treated as subjects to style, but rather as collaborators, co-designers, and authors of the space itself. I recruited individuals who are not as seen as often as they should in fashion systems, especially disabled and BIPOC participants. Many had never modeled before, and that was intentional. I wasn't interested in reproducing traditional fashion hierarchies. I wanted to challenge the idea that visibility belongs only to the people who already know how to perform within these existing systems. So instead of asking participants to adapt themselves to the runway, I asked something radically different. What if the runway adapted to them? That changed everything. My participants began designing their own ideal runway environments. One participant imagined a flower-themed runway filled with softness, nature, and transformation. Another imagined graffiti projections and immersive visuals. Others wanted personalized music, audience interaction, slower pacing, and accessible backstage support. And what struck me the most was this. When people are finally given authorship over spaces that once excluded them, they do not imagine scarcity. They imagine care. That became one of the most powerful lessons of this project. Accessibility is beyond ramps and measurements. Accessibility is dignity, is sensory awareness, it is communication, it is pacing, it is being expected in the room instead of merely accommodated once you arrive. And honestly, that realization changed everything for me. My participants showed me it's much bigger than that. People do not only want access to spaces, they want authorship. My project unfolded across multiple stages. Participants first designed their ideal runway experiences through co-design sessions and visual sketching. Then we conducted interviews around identity, belonging, and fashion. Afterward, participants entered the runway experience, followed by post-show reflections. Through that process, several themes began to emerge again and again: identity, belonging, transformation, collective care. Participants consistently described wanting spaces that felt more human rather than performative. And what emerged at the show was something I will never forget. Before the runway began, participants were nervous. Some even questioned whether they belonged there at all. But once they were out there, something shifted. Visibility became healing. Not because they were suddenly accepted by traditional beauty standards, but because they were witnessed on their own terms. And the audience felt it too. The atmosphere that night felt communal, emotional. We celebrated movement, difference, mobility aids, culture, and embodiment in ways fashion doesn't allow as often as they should. For some audience members, it was their first time seeing someone who looked like them reflected publicly in that kind of spotlight. And that matters. Seeing possibility can transform self-belief. This is why the system matters. We are currently living in an environment where systems, whether cultural or technical, are designed to predict, optimize, and replicate what already exists. Fashion is one of the earliest versions of this logic. If systems shaping tomorrow continue to be built on narrow assumptions about whose bodies are desirable, efficient, or usable, then what we are doing is actually scaling exclusion at a higher, rapid rate. And not only visible exclusion, but structural violence embedded in decision-making before representation ever happens. Temporal violence, where certain bodies are expected to move faster, adapt more, or endure more just to participate. And epimistic violence, where marginalized bodies are never treated as sources as knowledge in shaping the systems they exist in. It is the violence of being systemically unimagined. Of being visible enough to be included in diversity campaigns, but not structurally accounted for in how they are built. There's a difference between being seen and being considered, and too many systems stop at visibility. Instead of treating the runway as a spectacle, I treated it as a system that could be redesigned. In this redesigned system, accessibility is not retrofitted after casting decisions. It is built into the concept from the beginning. Timelines are flexible by default. Sensory needs, mobility, cultural expression, and care are part of that structure. And what comes from that is a more rich, creative, and humane future. With that being said, inclusion cannot be added through representation alone. It has to be designed into systems that determine what the future looks like. Right now, most inclusion is cosmetic. It is a visual adjustment layered on top of systems that were never redesigned. It's interesting how we were invited to the image of the future, but not the architecture side of it. So my friends, if we are serious about reimagining tomorrow, then accessibility cannot remain an afterthought to innovation. It just can't. It must become the condition that determines whether innovation is actually future-making or simply future-selecting. Reimagining the runway is the first of many. It started at my school, TEDxOCADU University, and my plan is to host more inclusive fashion shows across various schools in Ontario, Canada, then afterwards, globally. Real change doesn't happen from a single event. It requires ongoing commitment, consistency, and collective effort over time. So the next time we celebrate a seat at the table, I invite us to pause. Who designed the chair? Whose body does the room assume? Who is still being asked to adapt themselves just to belong? Because the future is being rehearsed right now through the systems we build, the spaces we normalize, and the bodies we choose to center. If we truly want more equitable futures, we cannot only invite more people into existing systems. Care is not a soft idea. It is a design methodology. And disabled, racialized bodies are not problems to solve. They are knowledge systems for building more livable futures. We have to rebuild the systems themselves, my friends. With that being said, the runway has been reimagined. Now it must be rebuilt intentionally, consistently. Thank you.